Welcome to Football Never Sleeps, the aspiring to be viral, caffeine craving, severe storm surviving weekly YouTube show all about Notre Dame football and its quasi-mysterious spring football schedule. I'm Eric Hansen. Luckily, with both internet and electricity tonight, he's Tyler James, knee-deep in recruiting and possibly flying branches. Together, we're the content creators and anti-aggregators at InsideNDSports.com. On tonight's show, we'll give you a glimpse of how the newcomers are fitting in through their eyes and the words of coordinators Mike Denbrock and Chris Ash. We'll tease that out to a wider angle view as well on those coaches' expectations and evaluations of the offense and defense this spring. We'll also chat with you about two big spring surprises that could significantly impact the team in the fall. O-line and D-line talk, got that too, plus the latest on recruiting and your live questions, quips, comments, and compliments. That's all ahead on this rendition of Football Never Sleeps.
All right, an electric intro there. Well done, Eric.
Yeah, electric, so to speak. There's a lot of people in my area that don't have it.
Perfectly done. Thankful you are okay with the internet and electricity, and we're thankful for everyone tuning in live tonight. We appreciate you guys for helping us with ideas during the show, and we love everyone who tunes in for the replay as well. As always, I have two asks of you. First, subscribe to us here on our Inside ND Sports YouTube channel. That way you get all of our content in your feed when it publishes here on YouTube. And then secondly, consider joining us over at InsideNDSports.com with a 30-day free trial using promo code NDYT. That gets you access to our premium coverage, all of our analysis and recruiting coverage, which when it comes to recruiting, we have something just about daily over on the Inside Lounge, and that's where we share our inside information first. There's a link to use the promo code in the video description below. And we will get rolling with our opening drive, Eric, about our coordinator catch-ups. Last week we spoke with Notre Dame offensive coordinator Mike Denbrock and defensive coordinator Chris Ash for the first time since spring practices opened earlier this month. Let's start with Chris Ash. I always have to be careful with how I say that because you spent time talking with him. I was focused on Denbrock. What were your biggest takeaways from his question and answer session?
Yeah, not effusive or detailed in his answers, but some general themes here. He feels like he hit the football lottery in terms of scheme that he can build upon, which is what he also said in his opening press conference. But really, you can tell that he feels it now. There's talent and depth. He feels like there's really good assistant coaches around him and really good culture. And we're starting to see some of the nuanced differences between Al Golden, his predecessor, and Chris Ash. And one of those that he was asked about was the way that the defensive ends pass rush, how they line up a little bit differently, how they have a little bit more schematic freedom.
Yeah, I don't. My sense was I don't know that Chris Ash wanted us to be too tuned into that right now.
No. He's probably mad at Jordan Botello
for discussing that, but I think he spoke a bit about being not being assigned a position, and that's something I asked him on his introductory press conference what he would be doing, and he said he'd be floating around. That's the first time he's done something like that as a defensive coordinator. I'm curious. I'll be curious to see what sort of advantages that brings him, how that can maybe make him a bit better defensive coordinator, and if it does, maybe it doesn't. But I think that's interesting. Another thing that stuck out to me was his praise for Drake Bowen as sort of the front runner for being a leader on the defense. It makes sense, but just Chris Ash having a new perspective on the defense, and obviously Notre Dame needing some leaders defensively after so much veteran leadership is gone. It'll be important how Drake Bowen embraces that role going into next season.
And then you talked to Mike Denbrock. So what did you learn?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, I asked the first question of him, and it was funny. He gave before we started, he said, "Okay, I'll answer any questions except quarterback questions." And he was joking. He said, "Because I think that'll take us about 10 seconds, then I'll get out of here." But I asked him about how does this differ for him from year one to year two, and he spoke about how having established what he wants to do offensively in year one, this gives him more opportunities to focus on the details, and not just him, but for the coaching staff, the rest of the offensive coaching staff and players that have sort of a baseline of knowledge that they're all on the same page with, and then sort of honing in and sharpening those details. He mentioned that it's going to be incredibly difficult to name the starting quarterback, which I don't think is a terrible surprise that he would describe it that way, but to hear him say it, I think is noteworthy. He seemed critical of Notre Dame's wide receiver play last season. He mentioned that Notre Dame dropped the football too much last year.
I'd agree with him.
But to hear the way he said it, and I'll get to the quote, and I tweeted the quote, and of course people don't actually read the story and just assume it's about the quarterback, but it was actually more about the receivers. He said that the position needs confidence and consistency, and his quote was, "We were not very confident in anything we did in the passing game a year ago." And then he thinks that they'll see a huge leap in year two with that. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight as it related to Denbrock was that he said that Eli Raridan, obviously Notre Dame's veteran tight end, has a chance to become one of the really good ones here at Notre Dame. So
I'm surprised he didn't get asked about Bauman, though.
No questions about Bauman. When you're the coordinator, your questions about your position players get a little bit limited. So I think the Raridan question was the only tight end question. And he might have got a follow-up as it related to Raridan.
And it's not like we have unlimited time with these guys either.
Right. Yeah. We're talking about like 10 minutes or so. And everyone has their own sort of story angles they're looking to write. Maybe everyone that was interested in writing about Bauman was talking to Chris Ash. I don't know. You also, Eric, spoke to defensive line coach Al Washington, and we also had a chance to talk to some Irish defensive lineman old and new in the last week. What were your biggest takeaways from Washington?
I'll tell you what, that was the most interesting conversation I've had with Al Washington since he's been at Notre Dame. And it started with he's dropped about 50 pounds. I mean, he looks like a different guy. But then it got even more interesting. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more detail, but I'll lead with it here. Jason Onye saga is a major storyline, both in how Indy supported him and who he might turn into from a football standpoint at a position group that really needed something like this. He talked about how the defensive ends, both spots, they're kind of cross-training, especially a guy like Josh Burnham, which isn't a surprise, but other guys, it is a little bit more of a surprise. Same thing with the interior defensive linemen. They felt like there were times last year they learned the lessons. Okay, we have a defensive tackle, but not healthy nose guards or vice versa, and they want to be able to have more position flexibility. Sean Sevillano's 341-pound frame came up, and they do like the fact that he is a different body type and he provides a different skill set. Bryce Young's potential came up. The money quote was, "I don't know that Bryce Young knows how good he can be, how great he can be," but it was just a really great conversation.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting. I think the question about Bryce Young was, when's he going to be a beast? And Al Washington's like, he's already a beast.
Yeah. I neglected to mention, too, he feels like the two new guys in the middle, Dawson and Hughes, are going to be able to help them. They're both interior defensive linemen.
Yeah, and if the answer was different than that, I guess maybe if only one of them contributed, you'd be okay with it. But I mean, Dawson shouldn't be here if he can't contribute, right?
Dawson was the proven one. I was really curious about Hughes. Still kind of am. I'm eager to see him play. And he's the USC transfer who's a junior. Dawson is a grad from Louisville.
And you mentioned Jason Onye. We have not had a chance to speak to him yet, which certainly isn't terribly surprising given him coming back from his absence last year due to personal reasons. What's your perspective on the discussion with Al Washington in terms of how Notre Dame has handled everything with Jason Onye?
Well, it really impacted Al Washington. I mean, he called it life-changing for him. And let's start with how the team processed it. When a coach comes into your living room to recruit you and says, "We're family, we'll support you when you need us on and off the field," well, here's confirmation of that. that a program walks the walk. They didn't give up on him, and they gave him the supports he needed. And now, he's a possible starter for that team come fall. Now, again, we've got a lot of bridges to cross before then, but this is the fact that he's even back and at Notre Dame is a great story. And I'm really eager when we get a chance to talk to Jason. I'll just put my tape recorder on slow so that I can process his fast talk. He is the fastest talker on the team.
Yeah, he does. He gets very excited, and he's been fun to talk to in the past. Obviously, this would be a much more serious conversation than some of the conversations in the past. Be curious to see what he's willing to share and tell us about that, because I think more and more folks who are dealing with mental health issues and their own battles, like when you share those stories, I think in the past, in generations past, I think people would be like, maybe frown upon that, or like think lesser of folks for doing that, where more frequently these days you'll get some support from that, and that'll inspire others who are dealing with something similar and have people to connect with them. And so I think Jason Onye's story should be a notable one if he can get back to competing at a high level and impacting Notre Dame the way we once thought he could.
Yeah, and for me, it's kind of personal. Tyler, you weren't around when I did this, but I wrote a story 26 Father's Days ago about my dad, who had just passed away in his battle with clinical depression. And I got more reception from that story than anyone I've ever written. And so it's really neat for me to see Jason Onye. And I'm not saying that's what Jason's battle was with. I'm just saying it was a mental health issue. And so it's really encouraging for me. And I've got a stake in seeing that saga play out.
All right, and you mentioned Jared Dawson. We had a chance to speak to him on Saturday. Well, you didn't, because you had to do women's basketball coverage, but the rest of us who were free from that, and somehow I made it over in time despite it being close there. I wanted to share some of the thoughts that Jared Dawson had about explaining why he came here. And it sort of dovetails into this conversation about Al Washington and Jason Onye. Jared Dawson spoke very highly about the coaching staff and the way they treat their players. He said, I've never met a coaching staff like this that really, really cares and talks to their players and tries to make them better at this type of level and pushes them to be great people, not just people on the field, but actually good people outside. He seemed to really connect with Notre Dame's coaching staff, and maybe that it's probably even grown since when he was being recruited as a transfer, and to see it come into play here in the spring with how Notre Dame treats its players. So that seems like a very positive message for Notre Dame, and one that you would think be able to help them when it comes to recruiting. But obviously what Notre Dame needs help with right now from Dawson is helping on the inside, because that was, like I mentioned earlier, like if he can't help this year, he shouldn't be at Notre Dame. Like that's what they brought him here for. And he seems like a very mature. I don't know that I want to call him a kid. He doesn't seem like a kid, and he's not. He's a grown man. And he feels like
he looks like it in the picture that we had for today. He looked like he could throw Elijah Hughes for 10 yards. So. Yeah,
he feels like he can make a difference. He missed some time last year with a dislocated elbow, but he said he's feeling good, and so it'll be interesting to see what his development looks like and how much of a difference maker he can be for Notre Dame next season.
And Al Washington described him as a disruptor, so a guy that could really help you in the run game and also give you some push up the middle like they got from Howard Cross and Riley Mills last year.
We also spoke with Joe Rudolph last week, and after we get through the Joe Rudolph and offensive line discussion, we'll hop into questions here. We have a number of good ones. Thank you, everyone, for submitting them. Feel free to keep sending them along. We spoke to Joe Rudolph. The biggest takeaway for me was how glowingly he spoke about Charles Jagusa at guard. I asked him what was the decision to play him at guard this spring, and then if what he did at the end of last season was sort of eye opening, and he was like, yeah, I mean, he said Charles Jagasa, like, he flashed as a player against Penn State playing guard for the first time in a college game. And he's like, you players don't really jump off the tape in the same way. Players being offensive linemen, he said, you usually don't see an offensive lineman sort of jump off the film in the way Charles Jagasa was jumping off the film. And so he feels like there's a chance that he could be as good as anyone in the country or better at that guard position. So he's not tied to Charles Jagasa playing guard for certain this next season. I think that'll depend on what he feels like is best for Notre Dame's offensive line. But I left that conversation be like, man, if that's how he feels about him as a guard, I guess maybe I should have asked if he feels like he could be one of the best tackles in the country too, because it would seem to be hard to move him out of guard if he feels like he'd be one of the best in the country there.
Yeah, my takeaway, and I was able to eavesdrop on that a little bit because Al Washington hadn't come up yet, and I was like, whoa. For me, I'm going to ask you the same question. Did this change your perspective on how things might play out in the fall? This is my answer to it, and then I want to hear yours. For me, not necessarily about where Jagasa ends up, but it gives Joe Rudolph more flexibility in the formula of determining who the first five is. For example, I think it brings, say, Gerby Lambert more seriously into this equation than if Charles Jagasa wasn't a really good guard, because then it's interesting. I mean, then where does Anthony Knapp? That doesn't necessarily mean Anthony Knapp becomes the left tackle. He could be the center. He could be, I guess, a guard, or he could be the first guy off the bench. So it's really interesting that Charles Jagasa is so good. Now, how did you interpret it, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might have been on last week's Football Never Sleeps, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I was like, is there anything that we could see in practice that would, or like at what point do we start taking serious the things that we may see on the offensive line in terms of where guys are lining up? And then we talked to Joe Rudolph. It's like, well, I guess we better start taking this Charles Jagasa thing at guard thing seriously. So yeah, I mean, I think it gives Notre Dame some more options potentially. I think tackle is such an important position. I mean, we can debate, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it when we talk about Emil Wagner later. Like, do you have to? Is left tackle more important than right tackle? But I think a lot of times you want to work outside in terms of figuring out who your tackles are, and then addressing your interior line. And so it's good to know that Jagasa can play inside, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's best for Notre Dame. So I still think Notre Dame has to know for sure what it has at offensive tackle, which I think it has a pretty good sense of what it has, at least with Emil Wagner and Anthony Knapp. But what does Gerby Lambert mean for that equation? I think that will be something to continue to monitor, and something that I thought would be the case coming into spring. But to hear such positive reviews about Jagasa at guard, I think is a bit eye-opening.
Right. There's not everybody that kind of fits that. I mean, Quentin Nelson could have played tackle. He had such good tackles next to him that there wasn't a need for that. But it would have been interesting had Aaron Banks came back, because the carrot was supposed to be, well, you could play left tackle,
right,
and move out there. And we hadn't seen him at tackle much since very early in his career in practice. But that reminds me of that situation a little bit. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to get to what sort of Joe Rudolph, he was asked, like, is it even possible to know who your best five is coming out of the spring? And he didn't say no necessarily, but that wasn't necessarily his focus either. He just feels like there's too many moving pieces, and like the focus really for him is just getting better. And I think that makes sense. Like we talked about, what can Jagasa give you at guard? What can Lambert give you at tackle? What can Sullivan Absher give you at a guard spot?
Or center.
Or center as well. I think all those things are things that Notre Dame can experiment with here in the spring, because it's not really putting together a starting lineup right now, because so many of its returning guys aren't being allowed to practice in full and are limited. And so the pieces of the puzzle aren't coming together in the spring as maybe you would hope they would in different situations.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that too, Tyler, because for a couple things. One is I know that people want to foster chemistry and so forth, but a lot of these guys have played next to each other. A lot of the guys that will end up being starters. The other thing is what Bob Morton had said on our show when we had the three-headed monster the 1 week on Football Never Sleeps, and that was the game reps are so much more important in terms of fostering that chemistry than the practice reps are. And they'll have some good opponents right out of the gate to help them
right
to move the chemistry along or get swept away. And so I feel pretty good about this approach.
And Joe Rudolph was asked about how the offensive line returnees are learning to lead, because Notre Dame does have a bit of a leadership void to fill from last season, given that Pat Coogan and Rocco Spindler are gone. Obviously, Pat Coogan was a very vocal leader of that group. But Joe Rudolph feels good about the guys that he has returning. When you talk about Emil Wagner and Billy Schrouth, the different personalities between the two of them, but
yeah,
but guys that have been through the battles and can help these younger guys. And I think the fact that they are sidelined a bit this spring gives them some more opportunities to help by teaching the younger guys. And I think you can also learn while you're teaching. I think you can some of the questions that you may get asked by your younger teammates can maybe make you think about things in different ways than you have before. So Rudolph emphasized that he wants to make sure that they're focused on their own rehab and getting healthy and stronger, and not like missing those parts of the opportunities that they're being given with Notre Dame's strength and conditioning team. But he thinks that those guys are getting something out of this. And but he didn't necessarily. I offered, I was like, do you think it's easier for those guys to lead when they're not actually having to fight for their own reps and stuff like that? And he didn't necessarily buy that. So, but he did think that those guys are being leaned on by their younger teammates, and they're being valuable assets to the group even when they're not practicing.
The contrast between Emil Wagner and Schrouth is almost, to me, kind of comical. I mean, I was listening to Emil while I was waiting for Al Washington to come up. Super cerebral guy, and he looks physically more put together than he ever has. But if he was leading a young guy, I could see him explaining the whys. This is how you do this is how you do that. And I could see Schrouth just getting and pushing somebody 10 yards down the field and say, that's how you do it. So I think it's different techniques.
Yeah, I asked Joe Rudolph, I was like, is it hard to keep Billy Schrouth out of practice? Because I just saw him, like, he was just sort of bouncing around watching, and like it just looked like he was eating at him, that he couldn't get out there and practice. Last thing I wanted to ask you, Eric, as it relates to the offensive line, and then we'll get into some of these submitted questions. If Emil Wagner is Notre Dame's best tackle, do you think he should stay on the right side or move over to the left?
Yeah, and Aaron Taylor's talked about this on our podcast before. Bob Morton's talked about this, and I asked Charles Jagas about this. I didn't ask Emil, but since Charles had played guard and tackle in the playoff, right and left, what's the more difficult conversion, the right-left thing or the guard tackle? And he actually thought right-left was. So I think if Emil is comfortable on the left, then and Charles Jagas, especially if Charles is going to be inside, then I would strongly consider it. If he's not, I'd leave him at right tackle. But if he's comfortable at left, I could see him over there. How about you? What do you think?
Yeah, because of how it played out last year, it makes me hesitant to believe that they will move Emil Wagner. Because I think he was, going into the season, Joe Rudolph probably felt Emil Wagner was his best tackle too. Like, I'd be surprised if he thought Anthony Knapp was better than him going into the season, but he put Knapp at left tackle and kept Emil Wagner at right tackle. And he talked about why he kept Wagner at right tackle. He felt that they played better on the right side and felt more comfortable over there. So I think that's okay if they keep it that way. The caveat of that is as long as you have viable options on the left side. And I, like, to me, when we're talking about, well, is Jagas a tackle or guard? Is Gerby Lambert ready? But like, if your worst case scenario is Anthony Knapp at left tackle, I think you're pretty good, right? I think we saw for Notre Dame that worked perfectly fine last year. Like, was he the best left tackle of all time? Certainly no, but like he was a freshman as well, and so you would anticipate him being able to improve and make strides there as a more experienced player. So,
I mean, Garby Lambert to me feels like more the prototypical right tackle. You think of a Mauler on that side, and Emil is, the shot put champion, a guy that used to run the 100-meter dash at one point, and the basketball player. Yeah. He seems like he would be good on the left. I'd like to see it, some practice reps. Maybe we'll get to see one of those.
All right. Let's see here. Let's get into the questions. Scott Fegan says, speaking of Lambert, I've heard a lot about Lambert working both right and left tackle. Is this more about him being a new starter or first off the bench? Also, do you see him more as a left tackle?
Yeah. What I think Joe Rudolph wants to do is see practice reps. When I talked to him down in Atlanta about different players who, what's their best position, he said, the way that we really kind of evaluate is very open-minded. I mean, we have ideas, but sometimes practice reps change your mind. And I think they want to see what Garby looks like on both sides. Again, I think he profiles more as a right tackle, but we haven't seen him in higher leverage situations, and Notre Dame certainly has the players that could kind of test that in practice. So I would be open to either, because he is really athletic, but he's I think 334, 6'7". He does kind of look like a right tackle. So, but you want to play around with it and see if somebody surprises you. I mean, again, that's why Sullivan Absher's taking center reps. They want to see if there's a better position for him.
Yeah, and Rudolph was asked about if he's more inclined to move one or the other. And I mean, right now he doesn't really have the ability to move Wagner because Wagner isn't practicing as much because they're giving him a lighter workload in the spring, and Lambert has been the one that's been moving back and forth. So I don't think that's necessarily limiting in terms of what Notre Dame can do later on. But I think they want to see Lambert in both of those spots to see where he's at right now and what he can do for them if he can be that starting left tackle. I think I almost feel like what you would move Wagner to left tackle if you felt like, okay, you know what, Garby Lambert can't do this left tackle thing, or we really want to move Knapp inside. And so like all the things you end up wanting to do leads you to say, you know what, let's make Wagner, the guy who's the most experience, to handle this curveball than one of these other guys that's taking on a different role and maybe not as experienced as Wagner. So I think there's a lot of ways this can play out. And I think it's just about trying to see what you have with Lambert because you just haven't had as much time with him. All right. Eric Swope says, had a chance to meet Nolan James today off campus and came away impressed by this young man. Definitely would like to know how much he will impact the team this year.
If everybody's healthy, I'm not sure that there's a clear path for him to contribute this year. But I mean, I know that they like his future, and I know that he likes his future because Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love won't be on the team next year, and that's going to open things up for a lot of people to compete. But they do like his skill set. I'll let Tyler talk about him since they share the same last name.
Yeah, I really like Nolan James. I think he's a talented player. It is really hard. I mean, I think it's going to be hard for Keatron Young to see the field, and he's got a year ahead of him, and I think he's more physically developed. But I really like Nolan James as a prospect. I think he knew what he was coming into at Notre Dame in terms of the talent and depth on the roster. So I think there's a bright future for him. Maybe it's limited to special teams as a freshman because there is just so much talent in that running back room for Notre Dame. All right. Brian Hammermill says, you guys have more access than just what's posted on Notre Dame's YouTube channel. How does that work?
I'll let you answer that because I don't understand exactly the question, so I'll just tag team on.
Yeah, I think what Brian's getting at, he may have been just asking some of the others in the chat, but we do have more access. So what Notre Dame shows on YouTube in terms of the interviews
what are interviews, not the practice clips. Gotcha.
Yeah. I think that's what he's referring to. That was when I saw the question come in, I thought that was what he meant. So they post the videos that are on YouTube or the interviews that are done on camera. And those are done separately from the interviews that are done with the writers, which are off camera. We're not taking pictures of video. We're just talking to them. Sometimes like there's upstairs and downstairs in the IAC, and that's how they do it. But on certain days we're like on the field talking to guys, and they're over on camera doing interviews. Our sessions with those guys are usually longer. The biggest reason is like sometimes what we're looking for as writers are more details, and we want to ask follow-up questions. Like if someone says something, like for instance, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, Devontae Smith, we were talking to him about why he came to Notre Dame, and he mentions a big reason why was the birth of his son, who's now 7 months old. He wanted to be closer to home. I want to know, okay, what's your son's name? What, like, is his mother living here? And those aren't things that maybe he wants to talk about on camera and don't make good sound bites, but those are information I want to have for my story. And we have a better opportunity to get that information as writers in these less formal interview settings than the ones that are on camera.
And it's funny too. I think there are some players and the coaches that are more comfortable with the camera off. It just feels like you're more having a conversation in somebody's den in their man cave than it does. And I really give Notre Dame a lot of credit for the separation, because we used to be thrown all together, and somebody would be talking about how their dying grandmother inspired them to come to Notre Dame, and then you'd get a question, well, what do it feel like to run out of the tunnel?
Yeah, right. Yeah, because they're just looking for a 10-second soundbite to put in a news package. And I would even say, like, the way that the camera interviews are set up now, like they have them stand at a podium and talk to the cameras, rather than we were in these scrums and there's these guys with cameras trying to fight their way in and weasel around and get up in their face. And it's just, I think, very uncomfortable for the student athletes. And I think it's a much better situation now. And so credit to Notre Dame for setting that up and being ahead of the curve on that. All right. Ron Robert asks, any info on how Logan Thomas is doing?
Al Washington is really high on Logan Thomas. It surprised me that he came back and was listed at 213, which is less than what he was listed at the beginning of last season, which is 224. I wasn't sitting in on his interview. I eavesdropped on a little bit because I was waiting for Al Washington, all these interviews that I caught a little bit of. And then certainly I saw his transcript, because we transcribe for each other so that we have access to all the interviews. And I think that's a great thing that we do as a beat. But the Logan Thomas, once he puts on some weight, I mean, he's got some get up and go. There's a lot of optimism about what he can turn into. He was a really good special teams player last year, and at 6'4", but again, 213 pounds. He probably needs to be in the 230s if he's going to impact this team at defensive at Viper End in the fall and progressively get bigger. What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is someone that has a bright future. It's like when people are so up in arms about Al Washington as a recruiter, it's like, well, so like these guys that are at Notre Dame that we think highly of, they don't get, like, you don't get credit for them. And I think some of the things that we're starting to see on the recruiting trail are maybe bucking the trend of what people are saying about Al, or have been saying about Al Washington in the past. But it's like, why is everyone like Logan Thomas doesn't count as someone that Al Washington recruited? Like he's a stud. I think he's going to be a very good player in the future. He has physical development that he needs to do. But if Jordan Botelho didn't return to Notre Dame, I think he would be pushing to play more this coming season. I think it's going to be harder given the numbers at that Viper end position with Jordan Botelho and Boubacar Traore healthy. And then obviously junior Tui Halamaka played well in the playoff last season. So I think he'll probably have a lot of opportunities on special teams again, which he did last season. But yeah, I think someone that's going to continue to grow, and I think someone that shouldn't be forgotten in terms of looking at Notre Dame's defensive line picture as a whole.
If Logan Thomas did the pro day drills, he would knock it out of the park with the numbers. He jumped up on the national radar in a combine. I think it was in San Antonio, Tyler. You can remind me, right before Notre Dame maybe offered him.
Yeah, I think that's
January, going after his junior season. And he had the best combine numbers. I mean, he was the star of that combine. So I think the future's really bright for him.
All right. A little bit of recruiting here from Jeff Stevens. When can the coaches and staff hit the recruiting trail again? Would you expect GM Mike Martin to travel on a few trips? And I have the answer to that, Eric. April 15th through May 24th is the next contact period. So Notre Dame will have a chance to do that after it gets done with its spring practices. I would imagine Notre Dame will wait till, because I think it seems like, Notre Dame's going to maybe have some practices after the blue gold game. And then I think after that, then Notre Dame will get back out there. And I know one of the priorities of that period will be quarterbacks coach Gino Guidugli seeing some of these 2027 quarterbacks that have been continuing to evaluate and have not offered any yet. And I think that's when we'll start to see Notre Dame make a decision in terms of who it wants to go after the 2027 class at the quarterback position. But then also, follow up on evaluating guys that it's continuing to recruit, seeing what guys are developing. Maybe if there's some late bloomers that it didn't get a chance to see, because part of Notre Dame's problem was that it didn't get out as much as it would have liked to in January because of its college football playoff run. Now, it did have other staffers getting out on the road, but it's a little bit different when you can have your assistant coaches out there than some of just your recruiting staffers. I would expect Mike Martin to make some trips. I don't know how many. I don't know that he'll be on the road the whole time. I think because in that time, part of his responsibilities will also be making sure Notre Dame's transfer portal comings and goings are under control as it relates to the spring portal window. So Notre Dame will have to balance that. But I think I can see there being some opportunities for him to get out there and establish some relationships with guys. I think some of it, because of the rules, you can't talk a lot with some of these recruits. So sometimes it's better to have them meet him here, because then you can spend more time with them. But sometimes getting his face out there, especially with someone who's new to college football, it could be helpful to get him out there.
One thing, too, along those lines, is we're a week away from the hearing that could really set some parameters in terms of roster limits and sizes and so forth. That is going to be next Monday. So we may have lots and lots to talk about on next Monday's Football Never Sleeps. So don't go to sleep on us.
All right. Brian Habermel says, do you see ND making a real run at any of the Stanford players hitting the portal?
I don't have a feel for that. I don't think that Notre Dame is really in the market of adding too many people. We've talked about what positions, if there's no injuries, where they might add. If, this Kevin Bauman story sounds like it's starting to blossom, so maybe there's less of a need for a tight end. If the interior defensive linemen weren't working out, they may shop there. But there doesn't seem like there'd be a lot of places that you would look at Stanford. I know, is it David Bailey is one
Correct.
of the really good players that's in the portal for Stanford, and yet where would he fit in with Notre Dame right now? They have linebackers coming out the yin-yang, and also a lot of really good, healthy Vipers in the fall. So I'm not sure that that's a fit.
Yeah, I think he would be a Viper at Notre Dame, and I just don't know how much of a priority that would be for Notre Dame to add him, especially if he's such a popular. He might demand a lot of NIL capital because teams that are maybe more desperate, especially at this time of year,
and revenue sharing,
maybe looking for adding him there. So I wouldn't rule him out if Notre Dame decides hey, you know what, it's worth it. He's that good of a player. Let's prioritize that. But I think Texas Tech is where he was at today.
Right.
And it doesn't take for how bad Stanford has been. It doesn't take a very good program for it to be in a step up for David Bailey in terms of talent around him. So it'd be interesting to see where he ends up. There's no other guys, in my opinion, necessarily that I've seen that make a ton of sense for Notre Dame to go after out of Stanford. But obviously it's of more interest in part because the academic requirements at Stanford, you would think like, okay, this should be an opportunity that Notre Dame can get things to line up there, but I just don't know that it'll work out that way. Speaking of Stanford, Mike DeVoy said, any idea whether Frank Reich is being considered for the permanent position or even interested?
I was kind of busy away from that story today. I saw the headline about him being the interim coach at Stanford. It sounded like at least they're going to do the search for the 2026. They are not prioritizing him. So I'm not sure the detail. Tyler may have a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton of insight. But I think they would consider it especially if he's successful at it. But I think he would I don't know that it would necessarily give him a leg up, because I imagine they'll probably do part of their search while the season's still going on and have guys that they're considering. It was just the timing of it, I think, put Stanford in a very tough situation in terms of finding someone to fill that role, especially as a long-term answer, because it's just not a good time with everyone underway with spring practice already and getting set up for next season. So an interesting move that they went to. I think it makes some sense. I know there's the concern is like, well, if he's an interim, like how many guys are going to come there as recruits? But I don't know. Like I don't know that you had a lot of better options that you could sell on being, okay, this is definitely the guy for the future that we hired in April of 2025 for next season. So it's the timing really put Stanford in a bad spot, and they'll have to deal with the consequences of that. All right, Jeff Stevens says, do you think college football will ban the Bush push? Should they?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure. I haven't given a lot of thought. How about you, Tyler? I don't really have an opinion. It's not something that's been bouncing around in my mind.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I know the NFL is having lots of discussions about eliminating potentially the it's not called the Bush push up there. It's called the tush push in the NFL. And there's like alleged injury concerns, but not a lot of injury data to support that there's an injury correlation to it. So it doesn't seem like a hot button issue and something that the NCAA should be that concerned about. So I don't see it being a top end issue or something that would be prioritized. Scott Fegan says, who do you see as the leaders going into the season? Leadership really got Notre Dame to the championship. Who steps in?
Yeah, Scott, Marcus Freeman was asked about this in his last press conference with us, and this is the answer I've been given. Spring is when you start to find this out. Spring and the summer, you start to see guys that weren't in position to lead have a chance to lead and kind of show it on the field, show it in the locker room, and so forth. I mean, there's people that you, from a personality standpoint, from their role, you say Drake Bowen. I mean, that was something that Al Golden mentioned in his meeting with the media after the championship game. So there are some guys that you say, yeah, he projects as a leader, but there are guys that surprise you and rise to the occasion. And that's what Marcus wants to see before he kind of goes down that road. Tyler, who do you think are some of the people that you might think would develop into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Emil Wagner is a candidate for that. I don't think he's like an outwardly vocal guy, but I think someone who definitely leads by example and would be capable of being a leader and captain going into next season. I know, like, sometimes you don't want to consider juniors for captainship, but I think Jeremiah loves a leader. I think the way he plays and the way he goes about his business, he shows a lot of leadership in that capacity. I mean, I'm sure that whoever the quarterback is, even if it's CJ Carr, is going to be a leader. Like, that's part of the responsibilities of the position, and I don't think you play quarterback if you're incapable of doing that. I would say Jordan Botelho is someone who I mentioned before. Like, with the breadth of his career and how far he's grown as a person and player, I think he would be a very interesting story and someone that could be relied upon as a leader, even though sometimes he likes to get after the whistle more than you'd like for guys who are known as leaders. So those would be names. I think Adon Schuler, he's another younger guy that I think it will be a leader, whether or not he's a captain or not. So I think there's a lot of good options. Christian Gray is a leader. I think there's plenty of leaders on this team. I don't think they're lacking for that. It's just maybe not a ton of guys that are seniors that you want to name captains right now.
Yeah, Great House is a guy I think has that kind of personality as well. So yeah, there's a lot of good candidates.
All right. TD4ND. Hey guys, is the Notre Dame GM/recruiting staff full now?
Well, if it's not, they ran the graphic too early because they did put out a graphic, and they could certainly add to that. And I think, again, the April 7th court decision on the House settlement that has to do with revenue sharing, I mean, that might nudge them in a direction to add staff and so forth. But I think the key positions seem to be all filled from what I understand, especially as it tends to recruiting. Now, there may be people that help manage salary cap per se, and that kind of stuff, but recruiting, it seems like they're rocking and rolling.
Yeah, I think maybe it's related to the House settlement that is impending. Like maybe once that's passed, for sure, they decide to bring someone on to help Mike Martin in his GM role with some of those things that will come with that. I think part of what Notre Dame's doing with Mike Martin and it being a little bit different than what Chad Bowden was doing, maybe it's trying to figure out what's needed from here as Notre Dame moves forward. So I wouldn't rule out them doing anything in the future, but I don't think there's anything that's imminent right now. All right. Ed Straub says, what unheralded player do you feel the coaches are most excited about?
Unheralded is always the key word in there. I would say, I mean, I think Kevin Bauman is the player I'm most excited about that's unheralded, just because you didn't know what you were going to get from him in a sixth season, and he thought he was going to be kicked to the curb. Great story there. I'll let Tyler answer while I think a little bit more because his brain works faster.
Yeah, one person that came to mind immediately to me, and I'm not sure if Al Washington said anything about Donovan Heinisch the other day, but anytime Al Washington talks about defensive linemen, he seems to talk about him glowingly, and I don't think that's someone that I think Notre Dame fans always will like, well, we need to get someone better than him, and I don't know that Al Washington always thinks that way about Donovan Heinisch, so that would be someone that comes to mind immediately. Let me think. In terms of the offensive side, I mean, like Jabron Payne is someone who I think people see as an afterthought and may end up being an afterthought for Notre Dame just because of the numbers at running back. But Dylan McCullough certainly liked him a lot. And my impression of Jaywan Sider, the new running backs coach, I think he likes Jabron Payne a lot too as a player. He's like, he doesn't look like someone that was hurt. He really gets after it and likes him as a player. So that doesn't mean that Jabron Payne's going to make a big impact this season, but I think sometimes there's guys that the coaches do like more than maybe the general public perceives them. Yeah.
Luke Talich is a guy that I know the coaching staff has liked, and different members that aren't here anymore, like Luke Talich. And he played a lot on special teams and he got 98 snaps, but that's far down the list from the other safeties. But I think he's probably in the mix. I think Josh Burnham is a guy that they really like and played not 100% last year and bounced back and forth between positions. I'm trying to think of somebody on offense. Somebody just jumped in my head and jumped out of it. KK Smith. I mean, Denbrock's always liked his speed and potential. I think this is the spring where KK Smith's got to make a move, though, because it's always like, yeah, boy, he's got speed. Well, that needs to start translating into production and playing time for him.
All right. Mike DeVoy says, any Cam Williams sightings or comments from the coaches?
We have Mike Brown, I want to say on Wednesday this week, I've watched him in drills. I was watching the wide receivers. He looks good. I mean, 6'2", 202 pounds. Physically, he looks like he belongs, but we're not seeing him in competitive situations yet. I don't think Cam got asked about in the Mike Denbrock interview, did he, Tyler?
No, I don't think he was asked about young receivers, but Mike Denbrock did not want to name anyone.
Yeah, so I think Wednesday is going to be our opportunity to ask about Cam Williams. But again, he looks the part in the drills, and we are going to have a chance to see a full practice next Saturday, and we will then see competitive situations, and that'll inform us a lot better than what we've seen to this point.
Adam Hugg says, even though we have less recruits than this time last year, do you feel like recruiting is on the rise talent-wise?
I'll let you answer that, and then I'll give my outsider's perspective since you're in the weeds every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly similar. I think there are, like, for instance, defensive line. I think Notre Dame's in better position with defensive linemen in this class than maybe it was in the last class, even though I do think people forget, like, Christopher Burgess is in the class, and some, like, rivals likes Joseph Reif and Dominic Hulak more than maybe some others people do. So I think Notre Dame is in positions with different guys that are very, very talented. Javian Osborne is a top 100 running back, and he's giving serious consideration to Notre Dame. But that's a position that Notre Dame should be able to recruit well at, right? Defensive line is one of those positions where Notre Dame hasn't always had that success with that high-end guys. And I think part of this is like some guys were very high early on, and then, or maybe weren't that highly thought of early on, and now they're rising. Like Ebenezer Iwatade, who Notre Dame is very high on, wasn't a very highly thought of recruit until recently, and some folks in the recruiting industry started to pay more attention to him. And so there's some progress there. Notre Dame's making progress at wide receiver. Kadon Finley being the highest ranked receiver that Notre Dame is having good success with, but hasn't landed a commitment from, certainly. So I think Notre Dame is in a good spot. Like, part of the reason that Notre Dame couldn't immediately build recruiting momentum after the championship game was because there was staff turnover. You had to wait for spring practice. You had to push spring practice back to get rolling, to get guys on campus. And now that you're getting guys on campus, Notre Dame's going to be in a position to start stacking up commitments. And I don't think that they'll get as far ahead as they were in terms of numbers last year going into the summer, but they're going to start catching up to where they were at, and being able to have a class that's thought more highly of, even though I think it's important. Like, a lot of the guys that have already been in Notre Dame's class are good recruits. There's only one 3-star recruit in the class in Dylan Faison, and the rest are 4-star recruits, and a handful of those guys are in the Rivals 250.
My thought is, and just reading Tyler's stuff, I think Notre Dame's starting to build some momentum. I mean, I think there's a lot of really good players visiting, both during the spring and setting up official visits. It seems like there's a wide receiver that's really moving into the crosshairs. That's a pretty good wide receiver, and there's others that are considering Notre Dame. And then it's always going to be interesting in November, especially with a new GM, with a new money structure in college football, how Notre Dame is a player in those kind of late November, early December battles. But if I were a recruiting junkie, and I'm not, I would be really encouraged that Notre Dame is moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, even this is something that in a matter of an hour or so, I think we'll know for sure where he's committing. Javari Flowers, a kid out of Miami, who's a 2025 cornerback, which Notre Dame already has 3 4-star 2025 cornerbacks it signed. But once he reclassified, Notre Dame started kicking the tires and seeing if it could get him on board. He's a top 100 cornerback. I think he might be 8th or 6th at the position. And so that's just an example. Like, Notre Dame is going to push even at positions where it feels like it's already strong, to try to get top end recruits. And I don't know how significantly different that is in the past, but we're starting to see some success for Notre Dame, or at least some buzz building for Notre Dame with some of those guys that you would hope would be high on Notre Dame and that are highly thought of recruits. Irish fan says the full practice viewing just mentioned, will that be the jersey scrimmage?
I'm thinking that it will be. The weird sequencing of practices this spring makes me wonder what the post blue gold practices will be like that, but I would think it is the jersey scrimmage. That's usually what we're invited to watch, and that's what I'm kind of counting on it being.
Yeah, it had only sort of dawned on me, I think maybe even earlier today, that I was like, you know what? We don't necessarily know for sure that's what that's going to be. I don't think anyone's ever said that's what that will be. I think we were hoping that's what
Tyler, we're not even sure when the interviews are starting sometimes.
So, we'll see what we get, but hopefully it's the jersey scrimmage. That was very valuable to see last spring. All right, let's get into some quick thoughts on a couple other topics before we get out of here, Eric. We talked to some players. You mentioned Kevin Bauman earlier, as someone that you're very interested in. You spent time talking with him, and you enjoyed it so much that you changed your game plan in terms of what you were going to write about that day. What stuck out from you about that conversation?
Well, if I'm ever in a foxhole and needed to be in that kind of situation, that's the guy I'm taking with me. He is amazingly strong in terms of what he's come through. And the fact is, he's not just a survivor. Now he wants to thrive. And this is, by his thoughts, this is the best version of himself before his 2 ACL tears. He missed 2 full seasons with ACL tears, or pretty close to full seasons, in 23 and 22. He's focused on the process, not the outcome. I love that. His relationship with Michael Mayer is really interesting. And this is a guy that was the number 5 tight end in that class. Michael Mayer was number 3. So this is an elite talent who's getting a 3rd or 4th chance to come back to Notre Dame. And I just think this is a win-win. No matter what this looks like at the end, the fact that he came back, he's just such a great example. And he's a guy I could see being a captain, especially if he becomes a guy that's going to play more. I could see him maybe being in a captain's role.
Yeah, I think he's a guy that people thought, well, maybe he just won't continue to play football. And I think he's given thought to that before, but he's stuck with it. And it would be a neat story if he's able to continue to contribute and find a new way to contribute for Notre Dame moving forward. I interviewed Devontae Smith on Saturday, and I talked a little bit about it earlier, mentioned it. And the first thing he mentioned when we asked him why he wanted to come to Notre Dame, and he said, I wanted to get closer to home. And that was in part because he wanted to.
And where is home for him, for people?
Home is from Cincinnati.
Okay.
He's from Cincinnati. He went to Cincinnati LaSalle High School. It's the same high school as Jabron Payne. And because he was from Cincinnati, in part, Mike Mickens and Marcus Freeman had been recruiting him when they were at Cincinnati, going that far back. So there were some long-term relationships there. And as I alluded to earlier, he had a son born 7 months ago, and he wanted to be closer to his son and the child's mother. And so they're in South Bend now with him. He felt like they sacrificed a lot in him being farther away last year, and wanted to get closer to home. And a lot of times when we talk about these guys, we think of things in terms of football, but and that obviously played a big role in him coming to Notre Dame, but he might not have left Alabama if it wasn't for his personal situation. And I thought that was sort of interesting, and an added perspective to it. And certainly as it relates to his ability as a football player, I think it'll benefit Notre Dame. He likes the production that Notre Dame has had at the nickelback position, especially with grad transfers in the 2 classes before him with Thomas Harper and Jordan Clark. His dream is to play in the NFL, and he thinks this will give him another opportunity to do that. And he admitted, he's like, listen, I've played around superstars my whole career. Like, that's what I'm used to at Alabama. So he likes the talent that Notre Dame has in its secondary. And just a funny note, he's a big time trash talker. We spoke to Will Pauling the week before, and he's like, because Wisconsin played Alabama last year, and he's like, yeah, Devontae Smith said something so wild to me that I don't even want to repeat it. And so we asked Devontae what it was, and he said he didn't remember it, but he said it probably wasn't very nice because sometimes that's how he gets out on the field. So I was very entertained in terms of talking to Devontae Smith and getting to know him better. You got to write a story on Jalen Stroman based on the transcript that was provided to you. What's your sense for Stroman's ability to fit in Notre Dame's defense? I know we've talked to others, the coaching staff, about him. And do you think his collarbone injury is going to impact that?
Yeah. So Chris Ash was kind of reluctant to single out players, not Stroman. He was very impressed with the way that Jalen has taken on the mental reps, the way he goes about film study, both in the team directed time and in his own time. Loves his film from Virginia Tech 2023, which was his last healthy season. He seems to have a skill set that would allow him to play either safety position. And again, going back to what your last part of that question, Tyler, you said, do you think the collarbone will affect him? It doesn't sound like it's going to affect him in Chris Ash's mind. I thought it was interesting. He went to Atlanta, watched the national championship game. That was 8 days after he committed to Notre Dame. He was watching Xavier Watson, said, that's the role that I want to play. I think he's got an interesting backstory. He missed his senior year because of the COVID delay in Virginia of the senior seasons, and then his early enrollment at Virginia Tech. He's got a brother, Greg Jr., who plays cornerback for the Giants. But he's got lots of competition, and he's aware of that, and yet he wants to help those younger guys along. He's an impressive guy.
All right. Let's tease what we're looking ahead to in terms of what we'll see the full practice. I'll try to squeeze in a bunch here at the end. What are the top 3 things you want to see in terms of Notre Dame's offense in this full practice that we'll get access to later this week?
How the quarterbacks express the different facets of the ND offense. That's number 1. 2, who's emerging among the wide receivers with special attention to the sophomores and Elijah Burris. And when I say sophomores, yes, Cam Williams is in that group. And then 3rd would be Kevin Bauman and the tight ends. How about you, Tyler?
Yeah, I had the quarterback, how the quarterbacks look and which young receivers are flashing, and then how is the offensive line depth progressing? That's something I'm interested in. We talked about maybe the positions don't matter as much right now, but a lot of guys are getting more opportunities that we haven't seen a lot of. I'm curious what those guys look like in practice. And then what are the 3 things you want to see on Notre Dame's defense?
Interior defensive line development, especially the newcomers. Safeties, number 2, safeties beyond Adon Schuler and Jalen Stroman, and there's lots of good ones to kind of sift through. And finally, what the linebacker rotation looks like, who lines up where, how they look. How about you?
Well, once again, we have the same 1 and 2. I had interior defensive line stepping up and the safeties next to Schuler. And then Devontae Smith, just how good is he? I wanted to see him in Notre Dame's defense, what he's bringing at that nickelback position after transferring from Alabama.
Okay, are we doing a lightning round with recruiting?
Yeah, go ahead and feed me some recruiting questions, and I'll get through them real quick.
2 defensive line targets in the 2025 class have commitment dates. What can you tell us about defensive end Rodney Dunham and defensive tackle Tiki Hola?
Yeah, so Dunham's announcing on April 10th. He's a 6'5" edge out of Charlotte, the number 11 edge and the number 121 overall. I like Notre Dame's chances there. I put a future cast in for Notre Dame there. And then Tiki Hola, he's planning to announce on May 10th. 6'3", 270 pounds, defensive tackle out of Bastrop, Texas. He's the number 16 defensive tackle and 194 overall. A 3-way battle right now in Notre Dame, SMU, and USC. But I'm not necessarily sure that the Trojans are a real threat there. So I think the Irish are in a pretty good position for that one as well.
Oh, okay. Penn State running back commitment Messiah Mickens says he's closing his recruitment. Do you think that will last?
Well, he said he was locked in with Penn State after that visit. He did an announcement with one of the collectives around Penn State. But a couple weeks before, he said he was locked in for official visits to Notre Dame and North Carolina. So I don't know what locked in means to Messiah Mickens. So I wouldn't guarantee he doesn't visit anywhere else. He's the number 16 running back in the country out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So wouldn't be surprised if he sticks with Penn State, but obviously has a relationship with Jaywan Sider. I think Notre Dame will still kick the tires, but it has other running back options. I mentioned Javian Osborne earlier as one of them, him being out of Texas.
Maybe he's angling for an NIL deal with Ziploc bags. Okay, which of the recruits who visited last week do you feel ND is in the best position for?
Yeah, I wrote an intel piece on our Insider Lounge message board earlier today. If you want to get more details on all the prominent guys who visited last week, the three I feel the best about are wide receiver Kadon Finley, linebacker Jacoby Clapper, and safety Zach Fort, who's currently committed to Georgia.
And who are some notable recruits expected to visit Notre Dame this week?
All right, a lot of talent coming to South Bend again. A couple of tight ends, Isaac Jensen and Evan Jacobson. A couple of defensive ends, Dre Quinn and Ebenezer Iwatade, and these guys are very good. I like those guys a lot. And then offensive tackles, Ikene Okboku and Gregory Patrick. So another good week of recruiting ahead. Some big-time names coming to South Bend, and we'll see how Notre Dame fares with their visits. And we appreciate you guys hanging with us for a few extra minutes tonight so we could get a little bit of everything in the discussion. We appreciate all the questions you sent. Appreciate everyone subscribing to the channel, liking the video. We will see you again next week. And make sure you check us out over at InsideNDSports.com. Promo code NDYT for a 30-day free trial.